Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Organizations always want to make a lot of money, but often they forget that the only way you make a lot of money is to first create a people-first culture, because it's the people that actually do the work that makes the money. So this is our opportunity to bring you individuals out there in the real world that are living this on a daily basis, to bring you their stories, and to see what collectively we can all learn from this. Today, our guest is Wayne Clancy, and I'm thrilled about having Wayne here. We've had a chance in the last couple of months to have a number of, conversations, and every time I get done, I'm jazzed. And, he runs a company called TheMindSuite, and I'm sure he'll tell you that he's leveraged that into some very fascinating work with government and not-for-profit and profit and big companies and small companies. And today, while I was preparing, I always go to your LinkedIn pages, and on Wayne's, he has something not everybody even puts on their LinkedIn pages. He lists his causes. And when I've heard him speak and when he and I have talked, it's absolutely clear he believes in living a purpose and taking his purpose through his business and bringing that kind of value to everybody he works with. So I'm really excited to make that part of our conversation today. So Wayne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it, Rick. And I've quite enjoyed our conversations as well. And the energy just keeps building. So it's great when you find like-minded people who are for it for the right reasons, which is helping people.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. And, your background of, not only what you're doing today, and I also know some of the things you're planning to do, but I'd love to have you share with people how you got here, because one of the terms I think of you as a Renaissance person. You've tried a variety of different things, and you've made lots of them really successful. So share your background and bring us up to where you are today.
Okay, well, it was an interesting beginning, and a lot of times these types of things are as they build onto where things are. And I was actually music was my first love when I was younger, and I'm a musician I wouldn't say by trade necessarily, but that's kind of where it was. And when I went to college, my good buddy and I played guitar, and he had a great voice, and we sang, and we played at bars and pubs and all that good stuff that went with it. And we got to the end of it all pretty close to when we were about to graduate, and we looked at each other one day and said, "Oh man, I don't want to go out and get a job." And in those days, entrepreneurism was fairly new, right? So it's, oh, get a job, you don't know. So we decided to go and work at our summer job, and then we took off in my old car and drove around North America for a long time. I don't even know how long it was, but many months. Just playing music, and we hit a bar and a restaurant and things like that. And just before we left, we were having a beer with one of our professors, and we had this conversation, and we came up with this idea around observe, ask questions, don't judge. And it was sort of a really interesting one, and it stuck with me in a big way. So as we were traveling around, we went across Canada initially, and then there were subtle differences between different Canadian cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and things. But when I hit the US, I was fascinated. 25 miles, and it was a different culture. People talked differently, they responded differently, and everything else that went with it. And it was just incredibly, and I watched it and I observed it, and because you're playing, you're not partying and things. So, I was able to kind of take a lot of this in, and for all that time, it really stuck with me. And when I got back, I had to go get a job, obviously, because we were broke. And I went out and I interviewed with a company that had just gone through, in the industry, had just gone through massive deregulation. And this was in the 80s. So, and the governments, both Canada and the United States, had controlled the pricing models in the logistics industry. And just to give you an idea on how inefficient they were, the government control ones, the prices were 30% higher then, and this is in the mid 80s, to where they are today. So they could be that inefficient. their idea of a VP of sales and marketing with 6'6" Norm who could outdrink everyone else. It was very unsophisticated. So anyway, so they went through this they had to figure this whole thing out. And this was an $800 million company at the time, which was a big organization. And I was interviewed and I could kind of present myself fairly well. And I looked a little older than I was, and I could kind of make up stuff that worked. And he was a crusty old accountant who kind of really didn't have much personality. And I met with him, and he said, "Okay, you're the marketing guy." I said, "Okay, can't like, what do you want me to do?" And he says, "I don't expletive. No, you're the marketing guy." That was my marching orders, literally. My initial card said Wayne Clancy, marketing. That was it. And my job was just go out and marketize the different divisions. So it was an incredible opportunity. And I was sitting in the boardroom one day with one of the divisions who focused on high value distribution. And in those days, the only place you could get your TV and your stereo and all that stuff was stores, right? It was physical distribution. And they had just done a customer satisfaction study, and they were way above all of their competitors. And I checked it. It was all legit. It was, it was done anonymously and all that kind of stuff. But their revenue was dropping and their margins were dropping, and they were really in very significant market problem, but they were so much better than all of their competitors. And I was in the boardroom with their leadership team. And sometimes you can see things that others don't if you're not stuck in the mud. And I just kind of, I said, how important is this stuff to the customers? Everybody looked around at each other. They never even asked the question. It was push marketing at its finest. We're great, use us. We're great, use us. So I was so fascinated, and that was when total quality management was first emerging. Deming had done his work and with bringing Japanese way of thinking to North America and things like that. And I literally went away that night and I created an algorithm which turned out to be a TQM system for humans. And where it was, what's the difference between how important something is and how well it's working? And I created this thing, and I called it the expectation gap index. And it was a simple calculation. You instead of just saying, "Are you satisfied?" and "Are they good?" it was, "How important is this as well?" And if it's really important, it's working well, it's 100, because people think 100 is good, perfect. If it's really important and not working well, it could be at 60 or 70% of expectation, and that's a problem. You got to fix it. But on the other hand, it could be not important, but working very well. So it could be at 135 or 140% of expectation. And so we went out and we did that. We went out and we went to the market and re-talked to them again. And almost all the scores came out at 135 and 140. Yeah, you're great, but they don't care. They're not prepared to pay for it, right? And it was another aha experience in the boardroom. And then everybody's kind of looking around. Okay, well, let's stop doing it. Oh, so we can be just like everyone else? Wait a minute. And I went out and I interviewed some of the key organizations at the time. And Apple, it was the first coming of Apple, and some other high-end retail distribution organizations. And I interviewed them, and I said, "Do you use QuickSet because of this?" They said, "Oh, absolutely, and this is why." And I said, "Would you put your name to it?" And they said they would. And I said, and I created this marketing program, and it was just out of luck. It wasn't anything brilliant, really, but it was, "What's it worth to you?" And what we did is we had their respected peers educate them on the importance factor, which pushed it up. We were already doing a great job, and the business turned around in no time. It was really insane because now people understood the value of what they were paying for, right? And so we ended up winning these international marketing awards, which was cool, right? I got down in Dallas, Texas, those big events we used to have back then with the 6,000 or 7,000 people in giant arenas, and we won our category. And I got to do this as a kid, but it always stuck with me. And I left the corporate world shortly afterwards, and I took this with me, and it was the customer experience. We called it the customer's mind, and we ended up calling the company the MindSuite. And it was amazing. And two of my early customers were Bayer and BASF, and the German engineers loved the fact that we could quantify these complex human relationships. So they kind of dragged me into the human side, which was culture and employee engagement and all that kind of stuff. The algorithm works there just as well, but it also allows us to celebrate differences in different regions and areas, right? Because of the importance factor. The way things are done, I don't know if you've done work in a New York boardroom, but it's pretty aggressive. People talk, they yell, they scream, and then they all go out for beers and hugs. because that is important to them. Whereas the same culture is not evident in an Atlanta boardroom or other boardrooms in other cities, and they're all subtly different. And we need to look at that. It's not one size fits all. So I kind of went through that, and we added more and more things to it, and we just expanded out the model. We added well-being, and we've been measuring wellness, well-being, mental health, resilience, all of those different areas, and how that interrelates to organizational culture and interrelates to customer experience and how they're all connected. And the cognitive conditioning that goes on, where people are conditioned to think a certain way, and how data can help break some of that. So get people to think not about right and wrong, but about what do we have in common, and let's rethink some of this stuff. And then we applied it to predictive outcomes like innovation. If a company has innovation as a key factor, are they likely to accomplish that based upon the kind of culture that they're creating and the way that they all interact? And how effective are our strategies and things like that? And how aligned are our leadership groups? Because a lot of times if the leadership team isn't aligned, then the rest of the organization isn't either.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And we created a couple models. One, and I always love Maslow's hierarchy of needs because it helped me understand some of the different components. And we created a version of that we call the organizational hierarchy of needs and the city hierarchy of needs, which are two models using a similar type of a system, but it shows the different elements involved in a really high functioning city and organization, because all of our systems have been applied to cities as well. We created what we call a city possibilities, where we measure community culture and how people are aligned and all sorts of things. So bringing all of these different areas together and then inviting people to help co-create the future rather than answer a survey was a very significant adjustment in it. And so many people feel ownership in that, and they were a part of it. And then the integrated partnership side, where we work with different organizations and groups and things like that. And I've, a few years ago, a couple of key things happened. One was I was introduced to John King, the author of Tribal Leadership. And if you're aware of it, it was a New York Times #1 bestseller. And it was one of the books that's been accredited of starting the whole culture conversation, really, in so many different ways. And John and I met a few years ago, and he was fascinated with what we were doing. So he asked me to help co-write his follow-up with it. And we're doing that right now. And it's really about synergizing and getting things working well together from a leadership perspective. Then the other part was, a large university had identified that they were turning out students who were less socially responsible than the ones they were getting. So they were very concerned about that. And what was happening was they were bringing in students and sort of educating them, but stripping away some of that humanity. And they had heard some work that we had done years ago when we created some of our resilience modeling, when we did a study on a town where people were living happy, healthy, productive lives well into their 90s. And one of the key elements that they felt was a tribute to that was the fact that they did not cognitively condition their young people through the ages of 10 to 20. Because those are the times, and I use the analogy of a computer. You can program a computer that 1 + 1 = 3, and it'll kick out 3 every time. You can program a human that 1 + 1 = 3, and that human will pass a lie detector test that the answer is 3, because we can be conditioned the same way. And the amount of cognitive conditioning that's going on globally is really unbelievable, right? Politically, faith-based, all sorts of different areas. And what it's done is it's created incredible divisiveness within it all. So we worked, we learned a lot of this, and this was like quite a while. This was even before all the green work. This was 20 years ago. We were doing this research. So we worked with them on that. And while I was there, I was introduced to somebody, the Dean of Humanities, and I went to see him, and he's like in the basement of a building. And it was, whoa, and I'm talking to him, and he's telling me about his commitment to the world, and they're pushing it out through individuals and things. And I said, this is such an important project. Why are you in the basement? And he says to me, well, because you can't measure humanity. It's only the disciplines that you can measure that get funding. And to a guy like me who's been measuring this complex stuff, because we have over 15,000 constructs now in our systems, I literally left there and went and I built. And I went back, I looked at Socrates, Aristotle, I talked with John, I looked at all the different elements we have and isolated what I call 14 constructs of humanity, built them into our system. and we started to measure it. And 100% of the companies that had high humanity scores were making more money. And it was just an incredible learning that we had, because before it was, oh yeah, we have to do that because we have to, right? Rather than, hey, there's a good reason for this. Green can be squared. We can do good things and make more money. And that's a part of this whole shift that's going on right now. So that's kind of where we're at. We built a platform, so it's all automated. It allows for deep segmentation, and that's kind of the story. And I could go on a lot longer, but I won't.
Well, we're going to come back to some of that for sure. And I just love your 14 constructs and the recognition that the organizations that do that their intent is to make the world a better place end up being better themselves from a financial standpoint.
Absolutely.
And that's the whole purpose of this particular podcast series, is helping organizations recognize that, because I've been consulting now since the 80s, and most of the time CEOs, when you talk about culture, it's, oh yeah, culture is important, but we're going to get to that after we make enough money that we can afford to manage our culture. Yeah. And somehow they think of culture as beer and brats on Friday, or foosball, or company picnics, and they don't think about the fact that people want to come to work and be fulfilled, and they want to come to work and do something important, and they want to contribute to the work that they're doing and be recognized. And so I'm just thrilled. So I'd like to have you talk about, I'm going to link three things together for you, or I'll let you link them together for me. One is you talked about the work you do with organizational culture. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about that. And as part of that, you also talked about co-create. So when I think about culture, I think about the organization creating its culture based on its purpose and its intent to transfer value to their customers and their communities. So I don't know if that's what co-create is for you, but I'd love to have you share on those two things just for a minute.
Okay, well, the co-creation side is, see, it's not a part of our current hierarchical structures that we have organizationally, right? Generally, a lot of times people are brought in, here's your job, work hard at it, one day you'll have my job, right? And shut up and listen. And the amount of knowledge and experience that's there with people, like all your customers, your employees, your team members, people that interact, your supply chain, all of that stuff. There's an incredible amount of knowledge there. And if you get 5 minutes out of each person, or even 1 minute of thought, add those together, it's incredible what that means. Now, getting that sometimes is difficult because it's crowded, it's difficult, and people, oh yeah, not another survey. Nope. It'll go off into a black hole, never to be heard from again, kind of thing. So when we use the term co-create, we invite people to help create or co-create the future together. What can we do? Share some of your thoughts and ideas. And because of the way our systems work is we have what we call a checkup, which is broader sense items. Then what comes out of the checkup is a deeper dive. So we say to people, hey, you and your fellow team members all felt that we're doing this really well. Yay, let's celebrate. Here's some things you'd like to see us do differently. What are your further thoughts, right? So we're now into a conversation. And then they feel heard and they have ownership in the outcomes. And that is a very fundamental difference on how a lot of the different things work, right? Because now, it's a team effort and we're doing something together and you appreciate my thinking. I've had leadership groups come to me and say, okay, after we do the organizational culture checkup, what do we do after that? I said, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? You're the expert. It depends on what comes out of the checkup. Yeah. Right? The checkup says, you got the skin disease. We're not going to treat you for, for something, for diabetes. Right? So it's really fascinating to me how we do that structure. And then the other part of the co-creation is ongoing, right? Yes. I had this conversation with a CEO about 10 or 11 years ago when I created what I call our GPS process, And I said to him, I said, so do you measure your financial outcomes once every 12 or 18 months? Yeah, you're nuts. I look at those every day. Okay. I said, do you look at your operating outcomes every 12 or 18? Yeah, crazy. I look at those every week. Okay. What's your most important asset? Oh, my people, of course. Oh, and you look at that every 12 or 18 months. So many companies do the annual
Oh, yeah.
engagement study, right? And a lot of times it gets pushed out. So they're working on old data, like literally a week in, because that changes. And certain events internally, et cetera, et cetera. So having an ongoing system of communication is kind of where we landed with it. And that's where the co-creation component comes out of it.
And do you have clients that embrace this and actually are actively engaged in applying it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We've got quite a few projects that we've worked on over a long time where we've had ongoing communications on how to do certain things and how to make certain changes within. Absolutely. Yeah.
And
Sometimes it's hard to get everybody on side with that kind of thing. Even when we show them the dashboard and the data and stuff like that, a lot of times the leadership groups get distracted, shall we say, right? And little things like, oh, I have, no, don't worry, go take care of this because there's some crisis happening or something, right? And they don't realize that they're actually minimizing the importance of some of those types of conversations. So a lot of times organizations go through a weave, and with some of the turnover and things, when you have to onboard new people into that kind of thinking, it can be a challenge. So yes, there are some great stories of outcomes of it, and then there are some ones that are challenging, but it's all a part of the ongoing process.
It's interesting as you're telling the story. I think of organizations where they get rid of the CEO because they think they have a bad culture, and they expect the next CEO to bring a new culture. And as you're talking about the co-creation and the continued evolution of that activity, it seems to me that organizations should have cultures and CEOs should be there to facilitate or support that culture's execution. Is that consistent with what you guys find?
Absolutely. We have a saying that great leaders are create an environment of communication and then get the hell out of the way. Excuse my language on that one, but it's true. Good leadership is an enablement system, not a management system. And there's a lot of misunderstanding on the difference between management and leadership. Right. And leaders ask questions, enable people, get out of the way and let them thrive and help to create and continue to support a focal difference. And good managers have a combination of both. Will manage process and systems and make sure they're working, but they enable their team members to be a part. So we call them leadership managers quite often, and in the tools as well. And when you have that kind of information, great managers can be that way. It's not just do what you're told. It's let's hear what you have to say and let's do this together.
Do organizations in general that you talk to, whether it's at a conference or as clients, do they recognize that this co-creation that you're talking about is building the culture, and that not doing it and ignoring it or putting it second or third on the list is also creating the culture?
Yes. Do they recognize it? A lot of the time they do. When there's an opportunity to do it properly, and really, with our dashboard and the way it works, you can't really argue with it quite often. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It works more often than it doesn't, obviously, and gets people engaged in the process. But there have been situations where you've just had a senior person or two who just know more than anyone else does and are just not prepared to be anything like that because they've been rewarded to be that way over the years, right? Because we unfortunately, so much of our success as a leader is still driven on financial outcomes, and you can squeeze a financial outcome out and look good and burn out people while you're doing it, and that's not sustainable, right? So there's stories of CEOs that build something that's incredible revenue, and then things start to collapse. Well, you burn your people out, and they can't continue with that type of thing anymore quite often. So, it can be complicated sometimes, but simplifying it and putting it in, and we use the analogy of financial outcomes and operating outcomes. And most companies run on a wobbly two-legged stool of the two. The stabilizing one is the human element, right? And that's a big part of our positioning, is we position it as an Android system for humans, shall we say, which is a way to measure the human element to go along with the operating and financial ones. That creates a very stable chair, shall we say.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you're talking, I'm reflecting back on some of the things we've learned, and that just if you think about Good to Great or In Search of Excellence, when they wrote about these great companies, in retrospect, what they defined as great companies were companies who were operationally excellent, fulfilling an immense demand in the market, not necessarily being great cultural companies, but great at fulfilling the demand in the market. Therefore, they made a lot of money and they look great. And both of those books, by the time the books came out, at least one or more of those companies was already either gone or disappearing rapidly, because the fulfillment had stopped, and they didn't have the culture to sustain in a new changing kind of world. And so that's the short-term decisions that a lot of people make in the name of financial outcomes often are threats or the death rattle to the long term.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we quite often refer to that as our triadic method. And one of the things that John King and I shared was both of us kind of entered into the conversations we've had on bringing the art and science of the leadership models together, was on both of us were using what we call triadic modeling in our systems, because triad stabilize. I mentioned one earlier: finance, operating, human, stable, right? Because we've got three. And the core of what both of us do is exactly what you were just saying: align, design, refine. It's so simple. Get people, and a lot of times leaders don't do that. They don't get people aligned around a common outcome. And that's the first. Doesn't mean we agree on how to get there, because alignment is very different than agreement, right?
Yes.
And so you have align, then design your plan, but then be prepared to refine, because it never works out as it's supposed to. What happens? A lot of companies, here's our plan. Oops, that didn't work. What's the new plan? Oops, that didn't work. What's the new, you know what I mean? They get caught in that without thinking through that it's a process. It's not just a plan that kind of comes out of nowhere on that whole thing.
Well, and your refine process is one that we, for whatever reason, don't do very often. We get into a system that works for a while. We're fulfilling demand, and there's lots of demand, so we get really, really good at the operations to fulfill, and we're not paying any attention to the fact the environment's changing. The financial world is changing. Our people are changing, and we keep trying to get good at this process that maybe the world doesn't even need the process anymore.
Yeah.
And so that refining piece is a really big deal.
Oh, absolutely. But it's natural for us in a lot of other things we do. When we're driving our car and you got the GPS on, the GPS says there's an accident up here, turn right here. We do it. You know what I mean? And it's not always that simple when you're talking organizationally, but being open to it and embracing the fact that change will happen.
Well, and co-create you were talking about, I would assume the co-create helps continually refine where we're going.
Absolutely. Continuous improvement. And, it's a concept that we built in that has been around for a while, but tends to be focused more operationally than it does humans wise, right? And how the teams interact and get together, and how do we adjust and make sure that we're constantly improving what we're doing. And we're looking at getting knowledge and information from as many sources as we can, and simplifying it. That is something that, we still haven't figured out how to do well.
Yeah. I'm going to change direction for a minute. Yep. Clearly, in your work, the work that is your company and purpose is really a big deal. When you work with your clients, how do you see purpose in how, a lot of businesses are run? Do they think about purpose? Is that part of where their alignment comes from?
Well, it's interesting. Some very successful ones are very true to their purpose and have had the ability to get people aligned around it, shall we say. But it's not as prevalent as it should be. It's really quite fascinating, and it's here's our purpose and here's a statement, right? And by putting that out, you're not necessarily engaging and pulling people into it, because a lot of times your team members don't feel ownership in it either, right? So that's another part of how we invite people to be a part of that. Are we? And a lot of times, in our systems, we measure out values and our purpose and things, and we talk to the people and how important is this to you and how well it's working. And many times we found out that the organizational purpose is not scored very high from an importance perspective by a large number of the employees. So yeah, management thought it up or had a consultant write it for them. But the fact is that it's not something that resonates and that the team hasn't bought into. So what's the purpose of having a purpose if your people aren't aligned around the outcome, right? It may sound good and it may work in some of the marketing, but if it's not there, or you're out there and somebody interacts with somebody and they're not treated very well, wait a minute, that's not your purpose, right? There's inconsistencies in the delivery.
Well, and I would submit that we almost never hire for purpose.
No, I would agree.
We hire for some kind of skill, or you live in the right area, or something, but we're not hiring because you believe in the purpose of the organization.
Yep. No, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's it's a very misunderstood, unfortunately.
Another one that is big in the work that we've done over the years is value transfer. And organizations, I don't hear many organizations talk about, intentionally mention, and try to measure the value as it's going to be determined by their customer. We sit at headquarters and we think we're doing something cool and we think it's valuable, but we don't really talk about, and I loved when you talked about co-create, you started right out by including customers and the community and that part of it. And so when I think about value transfer is really ultimately measured by the market out there, not at our headquarters. And I don't hear many organizations having that conversation. And as I was listening to your co-create, I was thinking, what a great opportunity to make the value creation and transfer actually part of that co-create.
Absolutely, and agree completely. And the value transfer, the co-create is actually works well with the customer base and with your supply chains. It really is a coordinated program that all of them need to be involved in, because everyone's got a play in it. Yeah. And by sharing information, insights with customers, organizations can help educate and inform them. But then by asking the questions, they can also help make better purchasing decisions. And then the customers feel heard. And when they feel heard, the service is going to be better, and better where it needs to be better. It's not one size fits all, right? Like how you sell in the different markets is very different. And how you measure culture in the different markets is very different.
Yes, yeah. It's one of the things that's hard with a lot of the work we've done in the past is people want to, and I coach people never to use this word, they want to demo how cool what it is they do is. And of course, first the demo is about the seller, and the buyer really normally cares more about the buyer than they do the seller. And the second part is if you take that demo word out, you put preview in, it forces you to ask questions from that buyer's frame of reference about how would their world be different, and how would that difference make things better, or make things more complex, or make things simpler. And it deepens that understanding between the different players.
Oh no, absolutely, and that's a part of our cognitive conditioning too. Certain words will trigger a certain response with people, right? And if they don't feel heard, if they don't feel a part of it, then they may buy it because they have to. But if there's another alternative comes along, then they'll buy that one if
Yeah.
there's a better price or whatever. You know what I mean? And absolutely, and it's creating ongoing real conversations, so everybody feels heard, right?
Yes, yeah,
And what it does is it kind of separates you from it, right? It, go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, I'm agreeing with you emphatically.
Well, I've had that, that time in the boardroom and running a research company. Like I don't offer my opinion ever. I don't offer my opinion politically from a faith point of view, none of that stuff, right? Because I'm a research guy. I got to
Yeah,
look at what it is and how people think. And I've been in a boardroom any time with one of those leaders who knows everything and I'll show this and I'll get, well, I don't believe in any of this stuff, right? And rather than argue, which doesn't get you anywhere, I'll say, well, you know what? You may not like it, and it may be wrong because that's what they want to hear, but this is how people think.
yep,
We need to respond and work with this because this is how they think. I get zero pushback on that because you
yep,
can't argue with that and retain any credibility with your team in the room. And what's that does though, it breaks some of that conditioning and cognitive approach to things to get people to go, oh, wait a minute here. Just ask that one question sometimes, can help to bring forward new ideations and new ways of doing things and
yeah,
strengthen ones you're already doing potentially, right? It's
yeah,
really amazing how simple things like that can make changes.
yeah. I love that part of your work because um, it's difficult for in the middle of the day when you're working hard and you're trying to get stuff done to remember that everything you do is the ultimate uh, evaluation of your work is out there someplace. It's how that community, that buyer, that person out there really responds to what it is you're doing. And part
Mhm.
of that response is, do they understand you and do you understand them and can you communicate to them? Because oftentimes it's just this misunderstanding of on both sides and the value gets lost in the language.
Yeah, and one thing, Rick, you'd be fascinated with. We have in our systems we measure all these different things, and so, sometimes it could be quite a few. And then we have one report. It's called the priorities report, and that report takes out all the things we measure. It takes the 10 best scores and the 10 worst scores and puts them in one report, so you can see the statement on it, right? And almost always leadership makes the short and long-term goals of the organization clear to employees. That almost always shows up in the problem side, almost always, right? As we go through. But and for many years, we had in our system, we had the 10, and they were in red because red is problematic quite often and things. So when people pull up the report, there's the 10 things there, and then the 10 good things were underneath, right? And I noticed over the years that everybody gets so wrapped up. Oh my God, look at that, look at this, look at that. And the energy's there and everybody's feeling difficulty. And we kind of get through it all. But I tried something new about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I started to go to the commonality first. It was longer than that, 7 years ago, maybe. I started going to the commonality first. So, hey, here's the things everybody agrees we're doing really well. Yay, let's celebrate. And you go through these things. And here's some things that you'd like to see us do differently. And then we get into some of that discussion. It completely changed the discussion. It broke down some of the barriers of difference. It allowed people to focus in on the commonality as well, right? And we've done a lot of work on the political side, and it's no secret to you how divided America is right now in so many different areas. And I've spoken at a number of conferences where we've got information back from people from a societal as well as an organizational perspective. And and a lot of them, one of the questions is, are you mainly Republican, mainly Democrat in it? And then we can segment by those.
Yep.
And I've been asked as this Canadian guy sometimes to speak, previous to COVID a lot more. And I would speak at a conference and I'd say, I'm from Canada, haha. we're doing, we're opening up some new operations here, and I just love it. But I keep hearing about how deeply divided everyone is. And I'm here to ask you, if you're divided as you think you are, then I proceed to show them all the things they share first.
Yep.
Then not. And it's amazing how many people talk to me and still connect with me, because now they were able to see, hey, you know what, we actually have more in common than we think we do. But there's this conditioning of they're wrong because of this type of thing. And that happens organizationally as well as politically. Politically is obviously the big one now. And how do you get people like from operations and sales working together, back to the sales side of things? And by showing the commonality of thinking and showing here's what the customers think from an operating and from a sales and relationship perspective, everybody can kind of get into agreement on it. And it's really quite fascinating how you can kind of build some of that in. And you talk about the customer experience and the revenue game. You bring operations, sales, marketing, administration together and create commonality and have that focused on a great customer outcome. You watch the profits.
Well, I love the leading with the commonality, because in my experience, one of the things that does is it gives us a common language to start with. These are all the things that we agree on, and we have a common dictionary for these words, these experiences, these purposes, or whatever. So now when we go to the other things, we at least have something to build on. Yeah. Where when we start with differences, we're not remembering all those common things, and we can't build on them because they're not conscious.
Absolutely. And a lot of that goes back to conditioning that has occurred over a period of time. In the political system, a lot of people are conditioned because we got 3 or 4 generations of Democrat or Republican conditioning that's occurring within families, where they could pass a lie detector test that the damn Republicans, the damn Democrats are stupid, but they couldn't give you an example of it, right? And that kind of conditioning is causing a lot of that. And I'm not saying that's the only thing, and I'm not trying to oversimplify, but the fact of the matter is that we don't tend to embrace commonality and look at differences as not necessarily being wrong and right, but being different. Yeah. I was asked that at a conference a number of years ago. I spoke, and it was a big one. It was in Dallas as well. And I spoke, and then I was afterwards. I was in we had a group, a group at the end talking about sort of a roundtable, panel kind of discussion. Then they opened it up to questions from the audience, and so the first guy gets a microphone. I can't even see him, right? You can see him on the screen, but the big thing. And the first thing he says is, "Wayne, tell me something. You're from Canada, aren't you?" I said, yeah. What word gave it away? He says, "Tell me something. How come you guys get along so much better than we do?" And here I am staring, and I was not prepared for that answer. But an old mentor of mine, he said, "Trust your flow." So I just opened my mouth and I said, you know what I find here in the United States? It's I'm right and you're wrong. And if I'm right and you're wrong, and you're right and I'm wrong, we don't have anything to talk about. But in Canada, we do say we're different. If we're different, we can still talk. And I kind of left it at that. And then like 40 seconds later, there was a big ovation. People, because it had broke that cognitive thinking of having to win and being right, as opposed to celebrating differences. I mean, the reason we have cars is that people celebrated learning from each other so we could have these incredible cars that we have, right? Yeah. So much innovation occurs when people will recognize differences, but work together towards, and they're aligned around it, and everyone's aligned around a common outcome, which is prosperous cities, places where people can treat each other well, lowering crime rates, all of those different, most people are aligned around those elements, but not necessarily in agreement on how to get there, right? And that's okay, because that brings new ideations and new innovations and new ways of thinking, but we need to celebrate more of it. And that happens within organizations all the time, especially between different functions and divisions and departments and locations, right? One size does not fit all. The culture in your New York office, as I mentioned earlier, is very different than, like a prosperous culture in the New York office is very different than a prosperous culture in the Atlanta office.
Absolutely. Okay, well, this has been great. I've got one last question for you. what's your advice for both new people coming into business today? You know, the kind of where you and your buddy were sitting there trying to figure out what do we do after school, and for the senior leadership who's dealing with, you know, some of the challenges are very similar, but we have some different challenges today than we did 40 years ago. So what's your advice for the new person coming out of school, and then for the senior leadership to create that culture that's going to be sustaining and making the world a better place?
Well, I think there's a number of different elements that kind of come to mind on it, but I think one of the key ones is recognizing diversity in thinking and in background. You know, we so often people, and we're humans and we get conditioned to think certain ways, and we have certain learnings that drive how we behave and what we think about and everything else that goes with it. And we've still got hierarchical systems that were designed in the 50s in our business world using military constructs that came in World War I and World War II. And in the military, you need that because lives are at stake. But we built those into our business and industrial, and that was the kickoff for the industrial age. We're now moving into the digital age. And sometimes when you're not involved in it and you're not stuck in it, you can see things differently. And sometimes there's new ideations that come that are not a part of that previous programming. And a lot of times younger people will come in now and still, you're young, shut up, do what you're told, listen, I'll teach you, I'll tell you, as opposed to, hey, you know what, you're new here. Do you see anything, let's talk and feel that there's that kind of an opportunity. And I get that quite often, I'll talk to people, those young people, they're so difficult. They feel, they're so innate, and I'll say, oh yeah, geez, remember your first boss? Oh yeah, what an idiot. How is that different? You're bringing a fresh perspective into something and they didn't want to hear it. That's no different with the different generations that go on. So how do we enable that? Well, we open it up to say, hey, different ideations, not right and wrong. Let's talk. Let's hear them. Let's make it and let's build on it. Now, they may not work and they may be wrong, but we can decide that together rather than just this kind of stuff. And that's really the ability to create that kind. And we need to do that as we move into the digital age, John and I, my work, we call it synergizing leadership, which is getting leaders to embrace change, to embrace learnings that have occurred throughout time and today, and get those working well together. And that really is where we need to go. And that'll be a part of a renaissance that there's an opportunity for us to create one of those right now, to create the kind of culture and environment that we all love the idea of having. We really do. And we have the capability of it. Open up to those types of things, both organizationally and from a community perspective. And the possibilities are endless. They really are.
Wow. This has been great today. I want to thank you for being here and for sharing. And every time we talk, I get so much out of it personally. So I thank you, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers are going to be as excited about it as I am.
Well, thank you, Rick, and I feel the same way. We're kindred spirits in so many ways that we've seen that, but we've both learned to be open enough to new ideas and new ways of doing things, and it's been a big part of who we are. And I think there's a timing now. We have a saying sometimes it's kind of interesting. There's nothing more frustrating than a great idea whose time has almost come.
Yes.
And I think now the time has come for some new ideations and thinking with all the changes going on. And it's, we've learned that with some of the work we're doing. It's not go back to, now that the COVID thing's over, go back to the way things were. It's how can we rethink some of this, embrace what we were doing well, but also look at new and different ways of doing things.
Yeah, we could do another podcast just on taking your co-create and some of your culture stuff and talk about the virtual nature of work today, and how you manage in that and how you serve your customers in that. But we'll have to leave that for another day.
Oh, absolutely. No, I'd love to, because there's a lot of insights, and I'm sure we can share a lot with because we both shared similar experiences that way. would welcome that opportunity, Rick, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I'm sure you're going to see Wayne's information so you can get a hold of him. But thank you, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.